Imagine a place where time no longer belongs to you, where steel walls daily remind you that you are just a tiny part of a massive machine, where sleep becomes a privilege and silence a luxury that never comes. This is not a movie, not a Navy advertisement. This is reality, hidden from the eyes of most people. On a multi-billion-dollar aircraft carrier, thousands of sailors live and work, each knowing that here there is neither day nor night, only endless shifts, the roar of turbines, the smell of machinery oil, and the sensation that this steel giant slowly, relentlessly drains your strength, your thoughts, your sleep, and sometimes even yourself. Today, we tell the story of a man who went through it all. The story of a young sailor who confronted not an enemy, but a system that can break people more cruelly than any storm and more dangerously than any battle. About what closed decks hide, about what parade videos never show, about what it's like to survive where every single day becomes a test. Welcome aboard. Let's begin. I had always considered myself a tough guy, someone capable of enduring a lot. Yet no training center, no instructor, no line in any manual had prepared me for what awaited a sailor inside the steel city known as an aircraft carrier. The first time I stepped aboard the USS Virginia Crest, it felt as if I were entering a massive machine operating by its own laws, completely beyond human comprehension. And every deck, every metal passage, every ladder seemed to whisper to me, "No one is waiting for you here, but if you stay, you will become part of me." I was young then, 20 years old, from Oklahoma, named Jason Miller, and I thought that serving in the U.S. Navy would give me purpose, discipline, brotherhood, and the chance to see the world. When I first heard Chief Petty Officer Grant bark, "5 hours of sleep every 24. Don't argue, kid, or you'll drop dead," I smiled, thinking he was just scaring the new recruits. Soon enough, I realized no one was exaggerating. On an aircraft carrier, silence doesn't exist. There is always something clanging, vibrating, rustling, firing, slamming. The engines roar as if trying to pierce the hull from within. The reactors never sleep for a second, and the takeoffs of the deck aviation every few minutes feel like blows to the nervous system. Sometimes it seemed to me that the noise became something alive, not merely a soundscape, but a separate entity that followed you, breathing right at your ear. The crew greeted me coldly. Nobody here is in a hurry to make friends, because the ship constantly grinds people down, and not everyone survives this pace. My roommates were Chris Hamilton, a tall, perennially unshaven guy with inflamed eyes, and Juan Rodriguez, a quiet, focused technician who woke at the slightest rustle and spoke no more than 3 words to me during the first day. Later, I would understand that this was not aloofness or arrogance, just chronic exhaustion. By the second day of service, my body began to protest. Rising from my bunk at 4:30 hours for the drill schedule, I felt sharp aches in my back and dim spots danced before my eyes. Lieutenant Harper, responsible for our section, cast a glance my way and muttered, "Miller, you look like you need 3 liters of coffee. Get up, you'll be learning on the move." He didn't smile. Nobody here smiled genuinely. The first week felt like an endless journey through the ship's narrow metal intestines, corridors, turns, hatches, ladders where 2 people cannot pass each other, constant ventilation noise, the smell of machine oil, salty air, and a metallic taste on the tongue that appears by the 3rd day and stays with you forever. I lost count of how many times I got lost, went the wrong way, and Chief Grant just smirked. "Give it another week and you'll find your way even with your eyes closed, or you'll go crazy before then." The hardest part was coming to terms with the lack of sleep, real sleep, the kind that lets you wake up feeling human. Here it was fragmented, anxious, filled with footsteps, metal groans, alarms, commands. 5 hours, that was the theory. In practice, 2, sometimes 3, and occasionally only 30-minute lapses of dozing between alarms. One night, while hauling a toolbox across the deck, Chris passed by and quietly said, "It won't get easier, brother. Just get used to dying slowly." He said it without irony. That's how people speak when they no longer expect change. For the first time, I felt that the ship was listening to our steps, our breathing, our thoughts, and I was terrified, not of the command, not of the storms, but of the fact that we were living inside something far greater than our individual lives. The ship lived its own life, and that life demanded our strength, our health, and our peace of mind. And all of this was only the beginning. I still remember that feeling, a mixture of anxiety and helplessness, when, during the 4th week of my service, I realized that the ship was not just a workplace. It was a living organism, and we, thousands of sailors, were its blood, its nerves, its muscles. And if even one of us broke down, the ship seemed to sense it and pressed harder, demanding that you get back in line, even if your knees shook and your eyes burned from sleep deprivation as if sand were scraping them. We lived in a schedule that no one would ever call normal. The day didn't start with sunrise. There is no sunrise on an aircraft carrier, but with a harsh alarm, the metallic voice of the intercom, and the jerk of a body that hadn't yet recovered from the previous shift. Even when you tried to take a breath, the air was heavy, thick with the smell of fuel, metal, damp pipes, and human fatigue. Lieutenant Harper drove us like we were bolts that needed tightening to the limit. "Faster, Miller! You're not a tourist here," he yelled when I messed up the control panel for the 3rd time that day. "The ship doesn't wait, and you're holding up the shift." I gritted my teeth. If I answered, I'd be reported. I stayed silent, and that was better. But the worst part was watching others break, even the strongest. Chris, who had walked around with a stone face at first, began snapping, not at us, but at the emptiness. We sat in the bunk room. He held a mug of coffee, his hands trembling. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. "Like someone's knocking under the deck. Like they're asking to be let out." I listened. Nothing. Just the usual rhythm of the ship. "It's the engine, Chris." "No," Chris covered his face with his hands. "It's not the engine. It's him." Him. The ship. It was then I realized for the first time that Hamilton was splitting at the seams. Juan held on longer. The focus technician who always kept quiet suddenly began talking to himself at night. I watched him stare at a single point on the ceiling, as if there was a problem there he had to solve. "Juan, are you okay?" He blinked several times like a man ripped awake from a dream. "Just thinking, always thinking. If we're off by even a millimeter," he raised his hands, fingers trembling, "this ship will bury us." He said it without a hint of doubt. Stress, sleepless nights, psychological breakdowns. I had heard these words from Chief Grant back at training. At the time, they seemed like mere precautions, but in reality, they were a warning, a real, hard, and deafening warning. Because the ship truly broke minds, especially at night. When you finally lay down and carts began rolling across the decks above you, someone cursed, someone ran, sirens wild in the distance, and even if you managed to fall asleep, your mind didn't switch off. It kept living in tension, as if preparing for a strike. I watched men burn out before my eyes. Some smoked constantly, retreating to distant corridors just to be alone for a moment. Some cracked their knuckles against bulkheads when their anger found no other outlet. Some simply went quiet. Too quiet, as if someone had turned the sound inside them. Sometimes I stood on the technical deck, looking down at the hot pipes humming like organ pipes in a massive cathedral, and thought, what if the ship is really consuming us? Down there, among the cables and pipes, it seemed you could hear a pulse, real, steady, heavy.
And one night, walking down a corridor after a 14-hour shift, I stopped so abruptly it felt as if someone had placed a hand on my shoulder, yet no one was behind me. I heard that same knock, knock, knock Chris had spoken about, as if someone were pounding a fist against a metal wall, as if asking to be let out. I froze, waited. The sound repeated, then vanished, dissolving into the hum of the ventilation. When I returned to the bunk room, the guys were asleep, or rather, trying to sleep. I lay down, stared at the ceiling, and realized the ship was truly alive. And to live on it meant fighting every day not against an enemy, but against it. Against its rhythm, against its knocks, against its cold steel heart. And this was only the beginning of what it planned to do to us.
I found myself more and more often losing the line between my own exhaustion and that strange sensation that the ship itself was gradually creeping too close, that its metal walls, scarred with pipes, cables, ventilation grills, and marks of endless repairs, didn't merely surround me but watched, waited, listened to every breath I took. The longer I served aboard the Virginia Crest, the more clearly I realized that there was no room here for personal space, no possibility to hide, to take a moment to breathe. Every movement, every step, every second of my life existed inside a vast mechanism that couldn't care less how much energy we expended, how many nights we went without sleep, how many thoughts remained unspoken. Sometimes I would go up to the upper decks, not to look at the sea because on an aircraft carrier the sea is almost invisible, reduced to something distant and mythical, hidden behind the rails and steel structures, but just to feel, for a fleeting second, the wind that cut through the engine roar, the catapult blasts, and the vibration of the deck. In those moments, I felt human again, not a tiny part of the enormous steel heart that pulsed ceaselessly and never slept. But the moment I descended back into those narrow corridors where people moved in an endless stream, where every glance seemed tired, burned out, empty, and where I myself noticed that I looked but did not see, listened but did not hear, the sense of freedom vanished, replaced by that same anxious awareness behind my back, as if the ship whispered something indistinct, low, crawling beneath the skin. In those days, Juan began to act stranger. He would sit over his tools so long that an entire shift could pass unnoticed. He spoke little, but when he did, it sounded like he weren't talking to me, but to someone standing behind me. One day, when I asked why he hadn't slept for nearly 2 days again, he slowly turned toward me and whispered, sending shivers down my spine. "Did you hear him calling?" I tried to joke, to say the ship groans under stress, that it was just metal, just physics, just our fatigue turning every sound into a threat, but Juan shook his head so slowly and confidently that I felt uneasy. "It's not metal, Jason," he whispered. "He wants us to listen. Always." Before I could answer, the alarm went off and we ran to our stations. But even while running, I heard him muttering the same word under his breath. "Listen, listen, listen." Chris was changing too, faster than we had expected. He stopped joking, stopped cursing, stopped drinking his endless liters of coffee. He simply walked the ship as if recalling some important, terrifying event that none of us had yet experienced. One night, when I woke to someone quietly speaking, I saw him standing at the bunk room door, gripping the frame as if it might snap him in two, whispering, "He's watching me through the wall." I got up, approached, laid my hand on his shoulder, but he flinched as if shocked by electricity and jerked away, eyes fixed on the metal bulkhead, which bore nothing but old scratches and traces of paint. "Chris," I said, trying to calm him, though I myself felt an uninvited chill rising from the floor. "If," he whispered, He spoke as though he knew something vital but couldn't share it, as if the ship had already claimed a piece of his mind and locked it deep inside its cabins, compartments, and corridors filled with noise. But the worst part was that one night I truly heard what the guys had been talking about. Not the hum, not the vibration, not the mechanical knocks, but a soft, barely perceptible tapping, rhythmic, as if someone were trying to reach out from inside the metal mass, calling my name, even though I knew no one could be there. I stopped, pressed my palm against the wall, and at that moment the deck beneath my feet seemed to shudder. Not like during a plane's takeoff, not like a sharp turn, but as if some enormous, invisible chest had taken a breath. I pulled my hand back, as if from fire. Walking down the corridor, I thought for the first time, what if we are not merely serving on a ship? What if we are living inside a creature that grows on our fears and feeds on our weakness? And what if one day it decides we are no longer needed? And that thought became my new companion. Quiet, persistent, relentless.
When we climbed up into the living quarters, where the air, despite the constant circulation, felt warmer and more human, I sensed the fatigue that had been held back only by discipline begin to seep through the familiar mask of composure, and in that moment it struck me that even the strongest among us were forced to hide our exhaustion, because here, on the ship, admitting you were tired was treated almost like a personal weakness, even though the inability to sleep properly was the root of most mistakes whispered about later in the corridors. I heard footsteps behind me, and when I turned, I saw Mark Henderson, tall, thin, with a strand of blonde hair that always fell over his forehead, giving his tired face an almost boyish expression, though we both knew he hadn't been a boy for a long time and had lived through things that would have left another man either hardened or broken. But Mark somehow held himself together through a strange blend of stubbornness and quiet inner kindness, a kindness he seemed almost embarrassed to show. "You holding up?" he asked in a whisper, because beside us, in the bunks, the night shift guys were sleeping, and even if their sleep was shallow, at least it was something, a fragment of those miserable 5 hours the regulations demanded, but that almost no one ever received honestly. I wanted to answer something like, "I'm managing," but instead I let out a longer breath than I intended, realizing that telling the truth meant admitting what I myself had been avoiding. "To be honest, Mark, I'm at my limit." And hearing my own words, I felt a strange relief, as if saying it aloud made the weight slightly less destructive. He nodded slowly, as though he had been expecting this, and sat on the edge of his bunk, leaning his elbows on his knees. The silence stretched between us, but it didn't feel heavy. On the contrary, it was rare and almost precious, because on a ship full of noise, commands, alarms, and constant industrial thunder, silence became a luxury reserved for those who weren't afraid to fill it with their real thoughts. "You're thinking about leaving too, aren't you?" he asked so quietly that his words seemed to dissolve into the air and become part of the hum of the ventilation. And my heart tightened for a moment, because this question wasn't just about my future, it was about our exhaustion, about the fact that we were no longer kids burning with the romance of the sea, but grown men whom the system was grinding down slowly and methodically. I didn't answer right away, but Mark didn't need me to. My face must have said enough, because he gave a small smile, the kind people give when they finally accept the inevitable, and murmured, "I don't want to live by their rules anymore either." Just then, the door to the compartment creaked open, and Josh Reeves walked in, our mechanic, short and sturdy, with permanent dark circles under his eyes that he hid behind jokes, but we knew he slept less than any of us, because breakdowns, malfunctions, and inspections landed on his shoulders more often than anyone else's. When he noticed us, he stopped and squinted and asked, "Do you guys feel it too, that the ship is squeezing us dry?" "He's been doing that for a long time," I replied, standing up, and the air in the room shifted, as if the three of us were standing on the edge of some internal decision that hadn't yet taken shape in words, but had been growing inside us for a long time. But before we could continue, a short signal sounded in the corridor, not an alarm, but one that demanded immediate assembly. and we straightened automatically as if everything we had just talked about had been nothing more than a tired dream, and headed for the exit. Because despite everything, we were still part of the ship, part of the routine, part of that discipline we hated but still obeyed, as if it were some ancient law of the sea rather than the whim of officers who had long since lost touch with reality. As we stepped into the corridor, I felt that the conversation we had started wasn't finished. It had merely changed shape, becoming not words, but a decision living quietly inside each of us, like the fourth member of our small, hidden crew, a decision that would one day break out and change everything.
The night that settled over the carrier was thick, viscous, and filled with a kind of hidden tension that seeped through every rivet of metal, every tremor of the decks, every drawn-out rumble of the machinery. I stood by a narrow porthole, watching the signal lights cut through the darkness, as if the ship were trying to prove to itself that it still controlled the world around it, even though, in truth, it was the world itself, merciless, cold, and indifferent, that controlled us, the people long since fused into its endless machine. Despite the hour, none of us truly slept, and I saw Mark, Josh, and even Raymond gathered in the mess. Yes, Raymond, the same Raymond who always kept to himself and never let emotions slip, but even he looked like the inner walls he had spent years building were starting to crack, letting out what he could no longer hide. Anxiety, exhaustion, and the fear that tomorrow might bring a point of no return. We sat in silence, and that silent closeness felt stranger than any conversation, because each of us knew we had reached the edge. To stay meant either breaking completely or losing the last intact part of ourselves under the pressure of endless shifts, humiliations, grueling inspections, sleepless nights, and the officer's cruelty, camouflaged beneath layers of regulations and noble words about duty. "You've made your decision, haven't you?" Mark said at last, breaking the silence, looking straight at me without blinking, as if afraid that a moment of weakness would stop him from saying it. And I understood then. Yesterday's conversation, interrupted by the signal, had returned tonight with twice the weight, demanding an ending. So I answered without hesitation, almost calmly, without the trembling that used to accompany such thoughts. "Yes, Mark, I'm leaving. Once we reach port, I'm leaving the Navy for good. I'm not letting this ship decide who I am or how much sleep I get anymore." Josh lifted his head. His perpetually tired eyes shimmered with something like relief mixed with envy, and he said hoarsely, "If I had your resolve, I'd do the same. But I can't. Not yet. I've got family, loans, obligations. I just can't drop everything, even though God knows I want to." Raymond, who almost never shared anything personal, suddenly spoke softly, barely audibly. "You're doing the right thing, Jason. We all knew that sooner or later one of us would break first, but you didn't break. You chose to leave before the ship takes everything from you." Those words hit harder than anything else that night, because they weren't about strength or weakness. They were about the ability to say enough in a place where the system expected eternal obedience. We stayed there a long time, absorbing the last minutes of silence, because we knew, by morning, we'd be swallowed again by the familiar roar, the commands, the shouting, the blown fuses, the sickening smell of oil, the cramped corridors, the suffocating walls, and the endless clang of metal that turned into nightmares when you tried to sleep. And when we finally parted ways, each heading to his bunk, I stood there a moment longer, looking at my friends, thinking how unfair it was that these strong men capable of surviving storms, fire, and battle alarms, were being broken not by enemies, not by war, but by a system meant to protect them, and which instead wore them down year after year, like rust eats through steel. At dawn, when a pale streak of light appeared over the ocean, we received a message from command.
In 24 hours, the carrier would return to port. Something tightened inside me at those words, as though I'd been pulled from a deep sleep where I had wandered for months, unable to believe in ending whatever come, and now every cell in my body, every memory, every wound, every sleepless night, fused into a single sensation. Soon, it would all be over. When I walked into the engine room for my last shift, the roar of the turbines no longer felt threatening, more familiar, almost home-like, though I knew this place had long since ceased to be a home, and had become more like a cage from which I had finally found an exit. Looking at the metal walls covered with nearly invisible traces of years of labor, I suddenly understood that I regretted nothing, not the hard days, not the injustice, not the pain, not the sleepless nights, because all of it had led me to this moment when, for the first time in a long time, I felt alive, capable of choosing where to go next. And when the ship moored and we were released ashore, I stepped down the gangway without looking back, because I knew, if I did, I would see not the steel giant, but the years of my life lived between noise and shadow, between orders and silent suffering, between duty and freedom. But that chapter was over. And ahead, another life.